class, we were talking about the movement called post-impressionism. This is a term that was only given to these works from the 1880s and 1890s. Was only given to them in the 1920s. They would have seen themselves as the torchbearers of Impressionism going forward, or if nothing else, just modern art. One of the trends of post-impressionism, as represented by Toulouse-Lautrec and Van Gogh, was a move toward a more subjective and expressive approach to art, rather than the sort of descriptive objectivity of the Impressionists. There's no attempt to capture a particular fleeting time of day or quality of light, but rather using the composition and the paint to give a very subjective idea of how the artist feels rather than what he sees. This screencast will talk about a subset of artists that are linked to the post-impressionists but have an international movement. This group called the symbolists. They take the subjectivity of Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec one step further even. The colors become increasingly more subjective and symbolic and entirely divorced from objectivity. In Gauguin's work on the left, for example, you'll notice the bright red ground, which doesn't attempt to describe the color of the ground, but is used for other purposes. Red used for its impact, its effect, rather than its descriptive quality. Also notice the scale juxtapositions, the huge figures cut off by the frame in the foreground, the couple in the upper right corner, or that tiny little cow, which you see here. Better seen in this detail, where the cow is in fact smaller than the human figures who appear to kneel behind it. Now, Gauguin is including things in his pictures for their symbolic value rather than trying to describe something he had seen. And this idea of this sort of symbolic inclusion of idiosyncratic elements is directly linked to a literary circle in Paris, which were known as the symbolists. This group of poets, novelists, as well as painters, focused on the supernatural and often on the dark side of the supernatural world. This makes them, in fact, very, very different from the Impressionists or the Realists. Since the middle of the 19th century, you've seen art focusing on the contemporary world, the role of industry in that world, for example. And here we have an artist who's focusing really on the metaphysical, not things he sees, but things he feels, things he thinks. As part of his interest in all things supernatural, Gauguin leaves Paris to look for a society that is more in touch with its traditions. He finds that industry has really gotten in the way of our connection with our spiritual selves. And so his first stop on his journey is the region called Brittany, this westernmost region of France that sticks out like a tongue into the Atlantic. By traveling here, Gauguin hopes to find a society in closer touch with its own traditions and thus more spiritual in the way that he sees it. So he focuses in our picture here on local women from Brittany, the Breton women, in their traditional clothing. Those hats and black blouses that you see are in fact the traditional clothes worn by Breton women. So he's trying to use them as symbols of a society untouched by progress. And in this particular image, as Gauguin explains it, they're emerging from church together. And on emerging from church, they see two men wrestling in the town square, which was another Breton tradition, to have these sort of village wrestling matches in the center square. But when they see this take place, they recall the sermon that they had just heard, delivered by the preacher who you see in the lower right corner of both of these slides. That sermon had been on Genesis 32, which talked about the story of how Jacob was wrestling with an angel, not realizing it was an angel, wrestled through the night as he struggled against God. Here they see the wrestling men in the Breton town square transformed into the Old Testament image of Jacob and the angel. Gauguin presents this as an intersection of the supernatural realm and the real world, and this is a key theme for the symbolist. And in this case, the visionary element, the part in the upper right corner, is kind of separated from the physical element in the lower left corner by that tree that runs diagonally through the composition. Interestingly enough, the preacher who is the only man with this group of women having come out of the church in the lower right corner, this preacher is in fact a self-portrait of Gauguin, although with his back turned slightly to us. You can tell by the limpid eyes, the high cheekbones, and that crooked nose. Here in the National Gallery, we have a self-portrait or two of Gauguin, and this one is particularly relevant to the vision after the sermon, because in our self-portrait, Gauguin appears as a saint. You can see the halo quite clearly on his head. It's almost as if maybe he's John the Baptist, because it looks as if his head is laying on a platter. John the Baptist was beheaded. At the same time, he's not entirely good. The flowers in the foreground transform into a snake that sits between his fingers almost like a cigarette. And you can see the head of that snake there. The association with the snake obviously associates Gauguin with Satan, who tempts us in the garden, tempted Adam and Eve. And the apple that hangs down directly behind his head sort of cement that connection of Gauguin as, at one level, the sinner, and on the other level, the saint, the good and the evil, both at the same time. And if we go back to the vision after the sermon, that tree that the women look past to see the wrestling match is, in fact, itself also an apple tree. And that again goes to the idea of Gauguin in the lower right corner as the one who inspires their vision, just as that's his role as a painter, isn't it? To inspire visions. But over and above that, he's also the one who tempts them. He's the only man in this group of women, after all. These sort of sexual overtones that we see with these two works by Gauguin, where he's both good and evil, savior and tempter, these are very strong in symbolism. The symbolist movement really drew no strong distinction between good and evil. Both were insights into the metaphysical world, into the world beyond the boundaries of the physical life. Well, in 1890, after a few years in Brittany, Gauguin goes even further afield, looking for these local traditions unspoiled by progress and industry. And he winds up in French Polynesia, in particular in Tahiti, where he spends his last decade of life. Again, he's going to these different places because he believes that these less developed cultures were closer to a sort of shared universal spirituality. And his paintings focus very much on the connection between the material and the spiritual world. So here, a woman with this vague title written in Polynesian, much to the confounding of his French audiences, says the words of the devil. So she is presumably hearing the words of the devil. I guess at first we are to presume that figure lit from below with the huge feet and the claw-like hands behind her, that this is the devil herself or himself as an androgynous figure. At the same time, there is again a focus not only on the material world meeting the spiritual world, but also on sin and sex. The image of the girl in the foreground looking rather unfrightenedly over her shoulder as she listens to the words of the devil, her hand over her vagina, her other hand on her cheek, seems very much to derive from traditional images of Eve after the fall, where she becomes aware of her nakedness. For Gauguin, I think this is a very potent symbol. He's gone to this Eden, this paradise, Tahiti, and he sees the locals there, and it's almost as if they become aware of their nakedness because of his presence there. At the same time, unlike Eve, banished from Eden, our woman in this picture has absolutely no shame whatsoever. Even though she's covering herself up, she has this coy, sort of interested look in what the words of the devil might actually have to say. The pose is also very much indebted to images of Venus, and since Venus is the goddess of love, that I think goes hand in hand with what I was just saying about the fact that she has a coy look on her face, that she's not particularly concerned with her nakedness. That ties into what we know about the model for the picture and Gauguin's biography. She is a 14-year-old native girl, and when Gauguin arrived in the backwoods on Tahiti to live with one of the tribes, they actually gave her to him as his wife, even though he had left a wife and children back in France. And that, again, adds to this sort of symbolist meaning of this sort of entwining of supernatural world and sexual overtones, is that perhaps the devil himself is Gauguin, and that he has, in fact, just taken her as his wife, and now she becomes, through that, aware of nakedness, sees herself in a Western way because of his presence there. Now, symbolism was very much an international movement on the right, a picture you've probably seen before, by artist born in Oslo, Norway, but spending most of his working career in the capital city of Germany, Berlin, where the cry, we see a figure screaming for no apparent reason, again a focus on sort of psychological turmoil, psychology as a certain outlet for the spiritual world, and the color used again for emotional and symbolic purposes rather than for descriptive purposes. It's very expressive, not at all objective, and it gives you kind of a sense of pantheistic forces at play, almost where the supernatural world erupts around this figure. The Cry was a series of 22 different paintings that Munch had done to illustrate the cycle of life, and they're all pretty harrowing. He had a pretty nasty life and was really quite depressed most of his life. The cycle of 22 pictures called the cycle of life, the frieze of life. None of them are particularly happy, and he reworked every one of the compositions in different media, different kinds of prints, for example, woodcuts, like the one we see on the left, and etchings. Nature for him seems very much as if it's alive. Again, he's not at all interested in how nature looks, but rather the psychological unease that's felt by the principal figure. You'll notice these works have a strong sense of alienation, and that's something that we saw when we looked at the works of Van Gogh as well. The psychology of alienation for both of them, Van Gogh and Munch. This sense of alienation was very, very personal. Munch's mother and sister had both died of tuberculosis. His father told the family who survived that they were all damned to hell. This led Munch to become an alcoholic and eventually mentally unstable. Van Gogh also, you remember, suffered from instability as well. So when we talk about Munch's sequence of the frieze of life, these 22 different images, we can see that they are all about anxiety. And even when they treat images of intimacy, such as this etching from the cycle of a couple embracing, you can see that while on one level it's deeply sexual, on the other level it's a little bit frightening. Their faces seem to mash into each other, almost meld into one, in a way that doesn't suggest so much unity as the fact that they're devouring one another, as if intimacy holds a certain amount of danger to it. This is a theme that runs through quite a bit of Munch's work. In fact, he does other images of couples embracing where he gives them titles like vampire on more than one different occasion, where the idea that the embrace, while at once romantic and intimate, is also frightening and dangerous. Again, the vampire part of this sequence of 22 images of the cycle of life. Again, again, with this international theme of symbolism and also with its overtones of eroticism, we move to Vienna and Gustav Klimt. Again, intimacy with psychological overtones, a couple embracing once again. He's kissing her on her cheek and she's totally subsumed to his will. It's not quite as frightening, but you do get a sense that under that pattern, the pattern of golds and flowers and colors, that there's something being sublimated, there's something being hidden there. And this is because Klimt is actually working in Vienna at the same time that Sigmund Freud is writing his theories about intimacy and sexuality and how our true feelings are in fact often sublimated under a wall that we build, beginning when we're very, very young, a wall that protects us from our true feelings. Klimt gives us images that show feeling under this entire facade of color and beauty. Our last Klimt is here locally, Baby in a Cradle, much more cute image from about 10 years later. But, you know, as I just mentioned, Freud, there's more to it than that. Freud talks about how our childhood is what shapes our entire life. It's where we build these safe spaces where we can hide our true emotions. And one wonders if Klimt's picture of a baby under this huge quilt isn't meant to show sort of this innocence already building its safety net of sublimation. Well, this screencast, I think, has shown the degree to which this symbolist movement takes on sort of supernatural themes, quasi-spiritual themes, but also overlays those with a strong sexual metaphoric content, which really runs through almost all of these works.